Hey guys, you're watching Dansky, the place to be to develop your creative skills. In this tutorial, we're going to learn how to create an awesome neon text effect, all in Photoshop. Rightio, so we're now in Photoshop and I've started by creating a new document that is 1920 by 1080 pixels, and I've set the color mode to RGB. And I'm actually going to be working on a black background to start with because we're creating some neon text and it's going to stand out and look a lot more vibrant off of a darker background. So just make sure you've got black or another dark color selected in the color picker, and just grab that paint bucket tool and just left click anywhere on the canvas, and we have black. Next we're going to select our type tool and just left click anywhere on the canvas, and we'll type a word. Now this can be any word you like. I'm going to use the word flicks and just select that text, and you can change the properties at the top. So I'm going to change the color to white, and we could increase the size from here. Change the font. I'm using Josephine Sans Bold Italic, or you can also go to Edit, Free Transform, and hold Shift and Alt on the keyboard and scale up from the center. So that's another way to quickly and easily scale text if you don't want to go through the character properties at the top. And of course we'll make sure this is as central as we possibly can on the canvas. And I'm going to right click and select duplicate, click OK. And I'm actually going to switch off this original Flicks text layer just so I have a copy of that text that is still editable, just in case I need to reference it or maybe create copies from it in future. So it's kind of like a backup. So we have our Flicks copy, and we can right click this and go to blending options and select gradient overlay, and just click anywhere on the gradient slider. I'll try and move this out of the way so you can see what I'm doing, and it will bring up this gradient editor. Now I've already created the gradient here, so I'm just going to click this. If you'd like to use the exact same gradient that I'm using, so it goes from an orange to a pink to a purple to a blue to a green, I'll add a link in the video description where you can go and download that gradient file. All you have to do is just go to load, navigate to the gradient file linked in the description, and it will load that in here. So there are the colors, or you can go ahead and create this yourself. So we'll click OK. This is our gradient, and I want this to run from left to right. So I'm going to change the angle, and we're going to go 0. And you can reverse it if you'd like it to go the other way, but I'm going to keep it so it runs from orange all the way through to the green like this. And click OK. Next, I'm going to duplicate this layer again, and just switch off that previous layer. And again, right click and select blending options. And this time I'm going to deselect gradient overlay. And from the main blending options screen, I'm actually going to drag the fill opacity all the way to 0. And you can see it completely disappears, but then I can select stroke. And I could change the fill type to gradient. And you guessed it, we're going to do the same thing again. Click the gradient slider, select that same gradient, change the angle to 0 so it runs from left to right, or from right to left, just essentially mirror what you did in the previous step. And you can choose where it aligns to, whether it's the inside or the outside or the center. I think I'm going to keep this set to center for this tutorial, and you can adjust the size as well. So we don't want it too thin, but we don't want it too thick as well. So I think I might go for let's go for 30 and see how we go. Now, the great thing about creating these kind of text effects and doing tutorials just like this is that every time I do this, every time I rehearse this tutorial, I always get a slightly different effect. So at the moment, we have our text and we have it as a fill, and we have the same thing as a stroke. So what we're going to do next is I'm actually going to right click on this layer and duplicate this. And then I'm going to go to filter, blur, and motion blur. And it will ask me if I want to rasterize or convert this to a smart object. We want to convert to a smart object. And the reason that we want to do that is because when it finishes loading, we can apply our blur and we can have this going in all manner of different angles. I think I'll keep this at 0 so it runs from left to right. And I can adjust the distance here so you can see I can bring this all the way up really high and click OK. But the reason that I like to have this as a smart object is because any filters I add up here are listed as smart filters, and I can double click them, go and edit them, I can drag them to the trash and delete them, so you get a lot more flexibility. And I can double click on the thumbnail of that smart object, and I've still got this layer inside here with all of those different blending options, so I can actually go back in and edit them. Any changes that I make, I just need to save when I close this down, and it will update those in the main document. So let's right click and duplicate that awesome motion blur layer again. And as I mentioned, you can edit it. So I'm going to double click on the motion blur text and it brings up that dialog box again. I'm going to change the angle this time. Nothing specific, we'll just go for 60. So it's on a bit of a diagonal. And maybe have it just not as crazy as it was before. In the distance, we'll bring it down a little bit. And click OK. And then I can hold Shift and select both of these layers. And I could even bring down the opacity a little bit. So we'll bring that down to about 80%, just so it's a tiny bit more subtle. Now, at the moment, we have a lot of Flix copy layers going on, and this is going to get really confusing further on in the video. So I think I'm going to start naming this. So I'm going to call this Flix Fill and then Flix Stroke. So you can just double click on the text of your layer and give it a name. So I'll call this Motion Blur Ho for horizontal, and then Motion Blur Ang for angle. And we can collapse these down as well. We don't need to see those motion blur effects. So it just helps keeping your layers nice and organized and a bit more tidy. Okay, what else can we do? Well, we can actually grab the stroke layer here again, right click this and select duplicate layer, click OK, drag this to the top, and I can double click on the layer name and just call this highlight. And what I need to do is go to blending options, to stroke, and I'll move this out the way, and we'll set the, I think we'll set the gradient type to this one here. So it's one of the default gradients and it's black going to transparency. Except when we click that, we want to actually change the black swatch to white. So we can double click on this black swatch and drag it up to white in the top left corner. So now we have white running to transparency. And we actually want this to run from the top to the bottom. So we'll change that angle back to 90. And that's the wrong way around. So we can click reverse or enter -90 in there. It's entirely up to you. And we now have a highlight on our text. And we can adjust the size if we want, but of course this is going to conflict with what we've already set. So it's probably best we just leave that highlight the same. You could have it a bit smaller, I suppose, and it would be slightly inset, but I think I'll keep it the same. And you can drag the white here on the gradient slider as well if you'd like the white to cover more of your text. And then when you're happy, just click OK. And what we can do is we can change the blending mode. Let's have a look if we zoom in. So we'll change the blending mode. Now, when you have blending options applied, blending modes tend to not work in a lot of cases. So the one way we can get around this is, again, right click this layer and convert it to a smart object. And Photoshop will do its thing. Now we can still double click that, go inside, we've got all of those options there. We can save and close if we need to make any changes. But now that this is a smart object, we can actually start applying blending modes. So you can see I changed that to an overlay there, and that white beautifully blends into the rest of the image. So it adds a really, really nice highlight. So now we can switch back on our Flix Fill, and I'm going to duplicate this and then switch it back off, just in case I need it again. And I'm going to, let's try applying motion blur to this now. And we, again, convert to smart object. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a reference image in front of me for what we're going to be creating, but how I'm going to get there is just something that always varies, and it makes it quite fun actually. So we'll crank this up, we can mess around with the angle. We could even try and mirror, so you can see here I'm trying to mirror the angle. What was it, 60 I think? So yeah, we'll go for that same angle. And click OK. So our text is getting pretty crazy now. And we can just bring that opacity down so it's a lot more subtle. So we'll go for 40%. And I'll just call this layer Flicks Fill Blur. Just so everything's nice and organized. We could even try applying a Gaussian blur on top of that. Don't think that's really going to do too much. No, that's fine. We'll leave that off. We'll keep it just as the motion blur. And something else that we're going to do is select Flick Stroke again. And I'm going to right click this, duplicate this layer. And then we'll right click and select blending options. And from the stroke panel, I'm going to change the width to half. So we'll go with 15. And then press return or click OK. And then I'm actually going to use the arrow keys just to move this out. And I'm actually going to drag this underneath as well and just change this to Flicks Stroke. And I'll call it thin. And then drop that opacity down to something like, let's go for 15, see how that looks. And we can even move this around up or down as well. It doesn't have to just be left or right. I might drop that down to 10% on the opacity. So lots of just experimentation here, fiddling around. Basically just have fun. Just have a ton of fun doing this. I love doing this. And we could even duplicate that layer and do another version. So we'll right click and select blending options, and we'll change that stroke again. We'll drop it down to, let's go for 8. We'll try and keep sort of roughly halving it. And I think for that one, maybe I'll apply a Gaussian blur, so like a really subtle blur. I'll just zoom in a bit so you can see what I'm doing. So that's the really, really thin one. So I'm just applying, let's go for 5 pixels of blur. And we could even do that, or do something similar to the other one, the 15 pixel one. So we'll just apply that Gaussian blur, convert to smart object, which is taking forever on my really old laptop. And we'll change that to 3, so it's not got as much blur. So the really thin line is a bit more blurred than that one. And they're all offset, no particular order, nice and random. Just keeps it looking interesting. And we can then go back to our Flick Stroke. Remember, this is our original layer we started with. And we could even drop the opacity down on that. So if we start to bring this down, you can see all the layers that we've got here, all the different strokes and lines and everything else. They just all start to really nicely blend into one another. And we could switch on our Flicks Fill if we wanted. And we could even drop that down to 5%. So you can see it just adds a bit more oomph to that fill. And I think something else I'm going to do is just add a new layer. Now this is going to be right at the bottom, and I'm going to call this gradient background. If I could spell background correctly. Grab that gradient tool and just click the slider up here. And of course we still have that gradient that we used at the beginning. And make sure you have linear gradient selected, that's the one on the left. Just do a test, just drag from the left to the right. Great, it's running in the right direction. If it's not, if you're doing it the other way around, just drag from right to left. So what I'm going to do is just left click, hold shift and drag from the left edge to the right edge, and it will apply that gradient to the gradient background layer. And now what I can do is bring the opacity down. In fact, what that does is that runs the gradient across the entire layer. Let's do that again. What I really want is to add a bit of a glow to the background, but one that relates to the text. So instead of going from the very left edge to the very right edge, I want this to line up a little bit more with my text. So I'm actually going to start my gradient about here and end it about here. Let's try that again, maybe bring it in a bit more. There we go. So you can see that the orange part of my text lines up a lot more with the orange part of the background. So if I then bring this down, let's go really low. We'll go for about 5%, I think. So it's really subtle. But the orange lettering here lines up with that orange part of the gradient, the pink lettering and so on. And you can keep doing that gradient over and over again. But the reason that I want this to be low and really subtle is just so some of this color is coming off onto the background. So we'll just change this second version here to gradient background, and the first one we did that went all the way from the left edge to the right edge, we'll drag that to the trash. We don't need that anymore. So a little bit of experimentation. And in fact, I'm going to create a new layer, another one, and drag this up. And I'm going to call this gradient ellipse. And just grab the elliptical marquee tool. I always struggle to say the word elliptical for some reason, but I'm doing pretty well today. And I'm going to feather this. So we'll try 100 pixels for now. With feathering, sometimes it's worth just experimenting. So I can just drag to create something like this around the text. We're going to add a bit of a glow to the background and just grab the paint bucket tool. And you can see by testing how the feathering looks. We'll go edit, undo, and maybe just bump up that feathering to 200. So that really depends on the size of your document and the amount of feathering that you'd like. So we'll grab the gradient tool again, under the paint bucket tool, left click, and drag to the right. In fact, I'll bring that in a bit more just so we're matching our text again. And we have something like this. And we can actually, well, first of all, let's right click this and make it a smart object. Remember, so what I was going to do then was add the gradient, add the Gaussian blur directly to that layer, but that would make it permanent. So now it's a smart object. I can go and add this blur. And it will blur this. We can go all the way like, there we go. That's more like it. But because this is a smart object now, what it will do is it will list this underneath, and I can go back in and edit that if I really want to. But we're just going to bring that all the way down. And then bring it up ever so slightly. So maybe we'll go for about 12%, maybe 10. So those two layers really just take it from a black background. We add a very subtle gradient across the entire canvas, but then we add this one here, which is a bit more of a blur around the text as well. And I'm going to go in now and just add a few more little refinements. So we have the highlight layer here, and I'm actually just going to duplicate this one and then change the blending mode back to normal, and then double click to go inside that because it is a smart object, this one, and then change the blending options and adjust that stroke. We'll go for 15, save and close. And it goes back to the main document. And then what I'm going to do is leave the blending mode set to normal, but bring the opacity down a little bit. And what that has done as well is, because it's a smart object and I duplicated it, once I edited it, it did update the other version as well. But that's fine, I quite like the way this works. It just adds that kind of inset sort of effect. So we have the glow running down the middle. So one of those is set to overlay, which is this one here. So that's the overlay one. And then we have another highlight layer on top that is set to normal. And it just kind of really helps bring that out. So I'll just leave those both called highlight for now. And the last thing I'm going to do is actually just give this whole thing a bit more oomph. So from the bottom of the layers panel, we'll click the adjustment icon and I'm going to go to brightness and contrast. And what we're going to do is increase the brightness. So this becomes a lot more vibrant, and increase the contrast as well. So let's see how far we can go. Now, of course, doing this will apply an adjustment layer at the very top of your layers panel. So it may affect other layers below it, but you can see the difference here from applying that layer. We've gone from something quite dark and a bit dull to actually quite vibrant and a bit crazy. And because it does that, it is affecting the gradient layers as well. So I think I might even tone these down to something like 2%. Let's try again. Yeah, we'll go for 2% on this one, and we'll go for 8% on that one. So I'm going to leave the adjustment layer here, the brightness and contrast one, at the very top, just so I can see this preview. And in fact, I think I'm going to add another adjustment layer, which is a solid color. And I'm actually going to change the background color. So at the beginning, we started with a black, 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 real black. I'm going to go for a very, very, very dark blue instead. And then just double click on that thumbnail and bring that down. So there we go, you can see the difference. Instead of black, we have a very dark blue. I'm actually going to select the background layer, hit delete or backspace, and rename this one background. You've been replaced. And just lock this layer here, just so it doesn't move by mistake or anything. And I'm just going to make some last minute final changes. I'm just going to figure out which layer's which. And maybe just start bringing down the blur. So I'm just changing that opacity to 20%. I've got the flicks stroke layer. So I'm going to bring that down even more. So we'll go for 30% on this. And please, when you're following this tutorial, this is really about teaching you these tips and techniques that you can use to enhance your text. Please feel free to go crazy, experiment, go wild. This is what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of literally fiddling around with what I've created. And it's just a case of finding the right layer. So we've got these blurs here. So I think I'm actually going to change that one. So I can double click the smart object again. And I'm actually going to make that thinner. So I'm going to go for 15 here as well. Close and save. And it will update those smart object changes in your main document. There we go. So a little bit more thinner. A little bit more thinner. I think that's terrible English, but never mind. Never mind. And we'll maybe duplicate this one again. And just give this more offset. So I'm just basically building up lots and lots of layers on top of each other to really try and create a lot of variety in the text. And these little kind of, these subtle accents, all of these lines, these different things, these blurs, they're little details, but when you add all of these layers up, you can see that it actually creates a much more effective end result. Let me just switch this one off and on. So I'm going to duplicate this one again as well. And then change the motion blur on the one below. We're going to make that even crazier. But I'm going to drop the opacity on that one to 10. So instead of one motion blur, we're going to have two. 1, 2. And I could spend hours upon hours messing around with this. But I think I'm probably going to leave it there. The only last thing that I am going to do is add some noise to the background. So what I can do is I can create a new layer just above the background and just fill this with black. And go to filter, noise, add noise, and change the amount. This will vary depending on your document size. So let's just increase this slowly. We can see how it will look. So we'll go for 3% monochromatic, Gaussian, okay. Now this is purely optional. I just like this because it just adds a little bit of noise, a little bit of texture to the background. And you can change the blending mode to something like overlay if you want to, or you can just drop the opacity and keep the blending mode as normal. So we could drop this down to around, let's say 40%. So it's really, really subtle. We'll just call that noise. But it's just one of those tiny little details that I think can really add up to a much more effective design at the end. As you can see, it has made it a lot blacker now. So that's why sometimes using blending modes like overlay for noise can be quite useful, even though it seems to have made it darker there. Let's try inverting it. There we go, that seems to work. So if I select my noise layer and just go image adjustments, invert, and increase that opacity. So oftentimes it's just a case of really experimenting with it. It's completely white now. Let's forget I did that. Let's forget I did that. We'll go back to having the noise here before I mess this up. So there we go, subtle noise on our noise layer, and we still get some of that blue coming through on the background. If we add a noise layer, what we can do is just unlock our background, double click on that color, and just bring a bit more blue back in. So adding the noise on the black layer darkened it. We can just counter that by bringing up the blue color on our background layer, and then just relock that again. And we're done now, so I don't need this flicks layer anymore. So let's just turn everything off and have a look at what we've done. So we started with a black background, which of course is now a very, very, very dark blue. We've added some noise. We've added the subtle gradients around the text and on the background. And if I just switch these layers on, you can see lots and lots of subtle individual layers, but when you actually add them all up, especially with the brightness and contrast one on top, it actually all adds up to a much more impactful overall design.
And there we go. That's how to create an awesome neon text effect in Photoshop. As always, guys, please feel free to leave any questions or comments down below. A huge, super massive thank you to the people who support me on Patreon. Thank you so much. If you'd like to become a patron or find out more information, there is a link in the description. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.